That the truth of a law is essentially reality no doubt again becomes for that consciousness, which remains at the level of observation, in antithesis to the notion and to what is intrinsically universal. In other words, it does not regard an object such as its law as having the nature of reason, but fancies that it is something alien. But it contradicts its own belief in the fact that it does not itself take its universality to mean that every single sensuous thing must have provided evidence of the law in order to enable the truth of the law to be asserted. The assertion that stones fall when raised above the ground and dropped certainly does not require us to make this experiment with every stone. It does perhaps mean that the experiment must have been made with at least a great number, and from this we can then by analogy draw an inference about the rest with the greatest probability or with perfect right. But analogy not only does not give a perfect right, but on account of its nature contradicts itself so often that the inference to be drawn from analogy itself is rather that analogy does not permit an inference to be made. Probability, which is what the result would amount to, loses in face of truth every distinction of lesser and greater probability. Let it be as great as it may, it is nothing as against truth. But the instinct of reason does in fact take such laws for truth, and it is when it does not discern necessity in them that it comes to make this distinction and reduces the truth of the matter itself to the level of probability in order to indicate the imperfect way in which truth presents itself to the consciousness, which has not yet attained to insight into the pure notion. For universality is present only as a simple immediate universality. But at the same time, on account of this universality, the law has truth for consciousness. That a stone falls is true for consciousness because in its heaviness the stone has in and for itself that essential relation to the earth which is expressed in falling. Consciousness thus has in experience the being of the law, but it has too the law in the form of a notion, and it is only because of the two aspects together that the law is true for consciousness. The law is valid as a law because it is manifested in the world of appearance and is also in its own self a notion. Here in paragraph 250, Hegel seems to be talking quite a lot about the structure of analogy, and there are some quite interesting remarks that he's making there, but they're in a larger context that has to do with what we can infer and what we can conclude about the nature of law. He's reintroduced law in the previous few paragraphs, and he noted the two sides that are involved in it. One is the notion and universality, which provides a kind of necessity, without which there is no law. On the other hand, the law has to actually apply to things, empirical things, things that we can encounter, can experience, which are sensible particulars, which are contingent. So how does all of this play itself out? In the beginning of this paragraph, he talks about what I'm just signaling here with an X as an antithesis, the way Miller translates it, or an opposition, a contradiction, a Gegensatz between the truth of law as reality, and there Hegel actually uses the term Realität, that's just being translated by its cognate, reality, and the notion and the in itself, or Miller has intrinsic universal. Why is there a contradiction or an opposition or an antithesis between these two? Between these ways of looking at law? He says, well, it's because consciousness is remaining at the level of observation. Notice that he doesn't say that there is an intrinsic contradiction that will never be overcome. He's saying that this is a contradiction which is rising to the fore at this point in observing reason's activities as we are observing that going on as phenomenologists. So he says, it does not regard an object such as its law as having the nature of reason, but fancies that it is something alien, something foreign to it. So what has to happen here is for reason, consciousness in this new gestalt of reason to, you might say, reappropriate law for itself. And that means understanding its own connection with law. So one of the questions that we can ask here that's not being framed as such in the text, but we're going to talk about the passage that it's coming out of is, well, what does universality mean as applied to sensuous beings? And notice that I've got this term all there, because that's what universality is about. Allgemeine, right? Everything. So he says it contradicts, this is reason, its own belief in the fact that it does not take its universality to mean that every single sensuous thing must have provided evidence of the law. So if the law is going to have universality, presumably it has to have universality in two distinguishable but connected ways. One is, presumably, this is the sort of science as predicting, right? Presumably it should tell us about what's going to be observed. If we have a law that makes sense of a particular range of phenomena, and it really does have a necessity, then it should tell us what we're going to see happen if this is the case. If we do the experiment this way, these are the results that we should have. That's one side. The other side is, well, where did you get that information from in the first place? Did you look at everything? And here is where Hegel's not actually talking about this at this point, but there's a little digression that I think is very useful for us. When we are making predictions, and they're not merely matters of probability statements, but matters about what has to be the case, we are engaging in deductive reasoning. And that's the way a lot of science works, at least in part of it, right? It says, granted that these conditions are the case, here's what we should observe. And of course it can be done in terms of probability and statistics. Let's put that aside for a moment though. In general, what we're saying is we've got deductive reasoning that can be done, providing an inference that should get us from this stuff to here in every case. What's the basis coming from? Where did you get that? Did you get that deductively? Well, as it turns out, maybe some of the stuff that got you there you got deductively, but a lot of it you had to acquire inductively. That is, by observing things and generalizing, not exactly universalizing, but generalizing what Hegel is here going to call an analogy or analogizing from those particular cases. And it could be that your sample size wasn't big enough, or it could be that you overlooked some important factor. There could be all sorts of things that don't necessarily invalidate, but certainly weaken inductive reasoning. And as it also turns out, here we're getting a little bit more into stuff that's getting away from Hegel per se, although you would find some of this discussed not with these terms, but with these concepts in his logic. There's also what Peirce calls abductive reasoning, where there's kind of a leap that's going on that would make sense out of things, right? I'm not going to try to explain abductive reasoning in detail here, but that also provides the basis for quite a lot of our talk about laws and regularities and the way things have to go. So, all that said, what's the basis? What does universality mean as applied to all sensuous beings? Hegel's going to use the example of a stone. He says, the assertion that stones fall when raised above the ground and drop certainly does not require us to make this experiment with every stone. Why not? That's the you might say, the back end, right? Well, I mean, why not? Because if you try to do that with every single stone, you'd never get done. You'd never conclude anything. And that would kind of contradict the whole point to trying to have some laws in the first place. If you have to know the entire universe before you can say anything meaningful, well, science never gets started in the first place. As a matter of fact, even getting yourself out of bed never happens in the first place. So what else does he say? It does perhaps mean the experiment must have been made with at least a great number. Inductive. We don't want just, leaps in the dark and inferences from very, very, few phenomena. Instead, we want to have, done quite a few experiments. This is where we get to analogy. So he says, we can, by analogy, draw an inference about the rest with the greatest probability or with perfect right. Now, what is analogy? The way that Hegel is talking about it here, analogy can be used in more than one sense of the term. So those who've read their Thomas Aquinas, or who've read glosses on Aristotle, or who are reading, Ricoeur and discussions about metaphor, don't get all worked up about this, because Hegel means something a bit different. He's talking about carrying out a process of inference, where we are saying, well, things are this way in these cases, so we're going to generalize to all cases. And so we observe some stones, and we see that when we drop them, they fall, right? Unless there's something else intervening. And we haven't seen all stones in the universe, but we do say that we know something about all stones. And Hegel says at this point, it seems like it's with perfect right, or with the greatest probability. So that's an analogy. Now, how reliable is analogy? Here's where he says that you've got a problem. He says analogy not only does not give a perfect right. Analogy is not a deductive process. Here what we're talking about is an inductive process. On account of its nature, it contradicts itself so often that the inference to be drawn from analogy itself is rather that analogy does not permit an inference to be made. What are we doing here? We're looking at analogy as such. And in some analogies, things work out, like with stones. Other analogies, perhaps with the body politic, or with history, or with what my uncle is going to say when I present him with this conundrum. Maybe those analogies don't actually work out. And so when we look in an objective way at analogies on a meta level, when we're looking as consciousness looking in on analogies, what we should say is, well, we've got this limited set of analogies. We haven't even looked at all analogies yet. But from that, we can actually conclude to all analogies. And what we can conclude is that we can't really use analogies to make reliable inferences. Reliable in what sense? Here's where we get to the other part that's quite important that Hegel's going to move to from this. So he says, probability, which is what we would get, loses in the face of truth every distinction of lesser and greater probability. So probability, if you take truth out of the picture, truth in sort of a robust sense, probability looks pretty good. Put it up against what Hegel is calling truth here, which is, to have some sort of systematic, reliable, full universal conception of the way things actually are, and probability starts to look kind of bad in comparison. And what I've got here is probability versus truth and probability as truth. Now the question is, which are you going to take? If you accept analogy at this point, then you're saying probability can substitute for truth. Probability can give us the best thing that we can come to for truth. As a matter of fact, that's as good as it's going to get, is probability. If there's something else that we can compare it against, and we don't necessarily have to have that completely sketched out at this point, then we have the versus relationship, probability versus truth. And that is what Hegel is saying that we have working. We may not have fully worked out the notion of it yet, but we do have it operative, you might say. So he goes on and he says, the instinct of reason does in fact take such laws for truth. What is he saying there? Is he saying that the instinct of reason takes analogy and the laws that come from analogy and the probability as truth? That would be one reading of this. And then he said, oh, stupid instinctive reason. Hegel's not saying that. What Hegel is actually saying is that in its instinctive activity, reason is already employing it's hard to not use the word notion or conception here. He's using a grasp of, again, grasp, right? Notice what we're doing. It's very hard to get away from this, even the language here. So I'm not even going to bother. reason has a notion, not completely worked out, but a notion of truth, a notion of the notion, as something more than mere probability, as something more than mere being. You might say, how can you have anything more than being? Being is all that there is. Well, being unfolds itself within the Hegelian dialectic so that it shows that there's more, as we go on than there was originally evident at the start. It was all there at the start, actually, but it just wasn't developed out. So law, for Hegel, in this section, he says, you need, again, these two sides. Being, or realitas, right? What is effective, what is actual, what is empirical, what is confronting us, what we can experience, and what goes beyond that, the notion, which reason can grasp. Reason takes us beyond the merely sensible. Reason takes us into what is still sensible within the sensible that we didn't grasp as such. So he goes on and he says, reason does take these laws of truth, and it is when it does not discern necessity in it that it comes to make this distinction, and reduces the truth of the matter to the level of probability in order to indicate the imperfect way in which truth presents itself to the consciousness which has not yet attained insight into the pure notion. For universality is present only as a simple, immediate universality. That's an imperfect way of doing things. And he says, at the same time, on account of this, the law has truth for consciousness. Why does the law have truth for consciousness? Not just because of this side, but because these two sides are connected with each other in the law. Law is more than just, say, a statement. Law is something that reason brings to the table and finds out there in nature. So he goes on and he says that a stone falls is true for consciousness. Why? Just because it observes it happening a whole bunch of times? No, because it finds something else going on. He says, because in its heaviness, the stone has in and for itself that essential relation to the earth which is expressed in falling. There is some truth that is more than just the mere phenomena that is being grasped. And a relation in and for itself between the stone and the earth in this case. We're talking about gravity. Remember, we saw that this law of gravity applied not only to stones, but to all sorts of other things, and that's going to raise some other, issues, which we saw already come up in force in the understanding. But he goes on and he says, consciousness thus has an experience, the being of the law, right? That's important. But it has to law in the form of notion. Only because of the two aspects together, the law is true for consciousness. You need this side, you need the applicability of the law, you need this side, the intelligibility of the law. The law is valid as law, he says, because it is manifested in the world of appearance. And also because in its own self, it is a notion. Very important realization about the nature of law. Because the law is at the same time in itself a notion, the instinct of reason in this consciousness proceeds to refine the law and its moments into a notion. It does this of necessity, but without knowing that this is what it aims to do. It puts the law to the test of experiment. The law, as it first appears, exhibits itself in an impure form, enveloped in single sensuous forms of being, and the notion constituting its nature is immersed in empirical material. In its experiments, the instinct of reason sets out to find what happens in such and such circumstances. The result is that the law seems only to be all the more immersed in sensuous being. The inner significance of this investigation is to find the pure conditions of the law. And this means nothing else, even if the consciousness expressing its meaning in this way were to think it meant something different, than to raise the law into the form of notion and to free its moments completely from being tied to a specific being. For example, negative electricity, which at first comes to be known, say, as resin electricity, and positive electricity as glass electricity, these, as a result of experiments, lose altogether such a significance and become purely positive and negative electricity, neither of which is any longer attached to a particular kind of thing. And we can no longer say that there are bodies which are positively electrical and others which are negatively electrical. In the same way, the relationship of acid and base and their reaction constitute a law in which these opposite sides appear as bodies. But these separated, detached things have no actuality. The power which forces them apart cannot prevent them from at once entering again into a process, for they are only this relation. They cannot, like a tooth or a claw, remain apart on their own and as such be pointed out. This essential nature of theirs to pass over immediately into a neutral product makes their being into a being which is implicitly superseded or universal. And acid and base have truth only as universals. Therefore, just as glass and resin can just as well be positively as negatively electrical, in the same way acid and base are not tied as properties to this or that actuality. Each thing is only relatively acid or base. What seems to be an absolute base or acid gets in the so-called synsomades the opposite significance in relation to something else. The result of the experiments is in this way to cancel the moments or activated sides as properties of specific things and to free the predicates from their subjects. These predicates are found only as universals, as in truth they are. Because of this self-subsistence, they get the name of matters, which are neither bodies nor properties. And certainly no one would call oxygen, positive and negative electricity, heat, and so forth, bodies. In paragraph 251, Hegel is continuing what he began doing in paragraph 250, but now we're going to see an important shift take place. One, you might say, in arrangement and in the corresponding understanding. So in the last paragraph, we had law as involving these two different moments, actually more than one paragraph before that. One was you might say, the empirical side, the particulars, the contingent, right, of the being of the law. And then on the other side, we have the notion. And the law should also be notion, should be necessity, should be universality. And these two exist in kind of a dynamic tension. Now what's going to happen is there's going to be a shift, right? And we're going to move from one to the other. And that's what's happening here. Hegel is sketching out for us a dynamic process by which we move from the empirical to the concept, the notion, the Begriff, right? And he's talking about reason doing this without necessarily planning it out, because what we're talking about here is reason. The way that Miller is translating it is reason is doing, the instinct of reason is how he calls it in this passage. It does this without necessarily, reasoning this out is the best way to do it. It's Vernunftinstinkt in German. Just reason as instinct, the instinct of reason, however you want to translate it. The point is, what we've got going here is this is what reason does when you let it do what it does, when you don't interfere with it in some way. Like, say, making it work all day long, right? Previous passages, previous dialectics, when it's not caught up with all sorts of other stuff. This is what reason can actually do by virtue of being reason. So he says, the instinct of reason in this consciousness proceeds to refine the law. There's this process of refining that's going to be taking place. And so we're moving from one thing to another thing. And he sketches this out in a couple different ways. First, he talks about refining the law and its moments, its things that it's applying to, right, into the notion. And what is the notion? The notion of law. So we have law being no longer just present on this side, present on this side. These exist and require each other. We're moving from this, which is okay, but not what we really want, to this, which is what we really want. he fills this in a bit. He tells us more about these things in these passages. He talks about the law in its moments as being enveloped in sensuous forms of being. That is, it is caught up in sensibility, it is caught up in, like he says, the notion is immersed in empirical material. So, what are examples of that? He's got, physical examples, which are quite interesting, but we could talk about, say, observing human behavior, and we get to know the way that human beings react. Let's think about, for example, the nature of anger, and are there any laws that we might deduce about anger? Well, we watch a lot of angry people, and we see that they respond in certain ways. And if we stay just bound up with the particulars, bound up with the cases, bound up with the studies, bound up with the what is in front of our eyes, maybe what gets us involved in feeling as well, we're never going to get to the generality, let alone the universality that we want in a law. Here, what we're aiming for are the pure conditions of the law, right? We're trying to say, well, what is the structure? What is the intelligible thing that runs through all of these? In this, he also talks about it as being freed from the specific being, but let's make that plural. It's freed from that whole manifold and mess of empirical material. That is what the notion is supposed to give us. We've got some examples here that we'll go into in just a moment, and we'd have to say a few things about the examples Hegel chooses. So he says, the law as it first appears exhibits itself in an impure form. This is impure. We want to get the purified form, right? In its experiments, he says, the instinctive reason sets us to find out what happens in such and such circumstances. Now, the experiments can just sort of circle around and keep coming right back to this spot. And, you fill up your laboratory notebook full of all sorts of observations, but you never actually draw any general conclusions. Well, you're not doing a very good chemistry experiment then, because you're not supposed to just say, oh, pretty lights, when you, put this salt in with powdered iron and throw it in the Bunsen burner, right? Or when you put these two, compounds together, they precipitate this other thing out, which is really cool. You're not just supposed to observe that. You're supposed to be drawing general conclusions about what's supposed to happen across the board when you do that kind of experiment with that kind of stuff, but also about other things, like about the nature of precipitation out of a solution in general, right? Or capillary action, or think about any of the things that when you were a kid they made you putter around with, and maybe you found fascinating, or maybe you found deadly boring. Probably had a lot to do with who your teacher was. So he says it sets out to find out what happens in such and such circumstances. So the law then appears to be more immersed in sensuous being. The inner significance of the investigation is to get to here. This is where the action is, you might say. This is what the experiments are supposed to be about. If they're not, then we don't have progress being made. So he goes on and he says, we want to raise the law into the form of notion, free its moments from being tied to a specific being. Now he starts giving examples. Now, before we start looking at these examples, I do want to say once again, as I've said in a few previous passages, that when it comes to natural science, we know a lot more than Hegel did at his own time. He is relying on sort of a representative sample of some of the better physical and chemical and biological studies available to him at the time. There's theories that he endorses that we, with what we know about physical things, like, for example, acids and bases, can't really get behind. And what we have to do at this point is choose between a couple of alternatives. One is we can say, we're just going to blank out this portion of the text, sort of like reductors. So wherever Hegel made some sort of mistake and it doesn't conform to our current pretty good understanding of physical science, we just throw that crap out. We're not even going to bother looking at it. It's a bit of baby with the bathwater there, throwing out way too much to do that. The other extreme would be to say, Hegel must be right in some sort of way, so we're going to find some way to make this work. that's not going to be a viable solution either, and you're not going to see me trying to do that because I've seen enough other people try to do that, and the results of it are usually, at best comical, at worst tragic. And what remains to us in between? Well, let's try to figure out what the hell Hegel was trying to get at in telling us, and see whether there really is something valuable that's being conveyed in his discussion of this. Maybe he's wrong about the nature of acids and bases to some degree, but maybe there's some way in which this actually does make sense, and let's keep that. And let's not try to say, well, now the whole edifice falls apart, because it doesn't. We can go on to further sections, even within, or further paragraphs, even within the section, and say, well, that part back there didn't quite make sense, or it doesn't conform to what we know, just as much as, Hegel's criticisms of Stoicism, for example, are not entirely on base, but when you see what he's driving at, then it does fall into place within the dialectic. And it's okay for Hegel to be wrong about some things. We can still do commentary on Hegel. It's still a valuable activity. It's still valuable for you to be studying the text. What you want to think about is the balance of right over wrong. All right, so let's look at the specific examples that he uses. Here he uses physical examples that were fascinating everybody at the time. Electricity, he talks in terms of positive and negative electricity. Acids and bases, chemistry was not in its infancy, but was in its early stages, let's say. It was nowhere near what it was in the later 19th century, let alone 20th century. Now, what is he drawing from this? Okay, so think about what we've got here. Those things, like positive and negative electricity, acid and base as such, those are what we're talking about over here as the notion of the law. We're talking about physical phenomena, but we're talking about them in a very general way that we take for granted, because this is a hard-won achievement that reason in history had to work out, and we just open up our high school chemistry text or whatever, and on page 10 it tells us, well, acids have a pH between this range and that range, up to 7, right? Bases from 7 on up. Well, there's the neutral zone, of course. Electricity works in these ways. We even have great explanations about the latest science, where positive and negative electrical charge come from, how they, how static happens. They didn't have all of that at that time, and those things, again, were won by reason carrying out this process of refining. So what does he start out talking about? Well, the sort of things that when we have children learn by doing with electricity, we have them play around with. So he talks, for example, about resin electricity and glass electricity. Now, we could do other things, right? We could do things playing around with static charges and balloons, and the kid might associate electricity with, well, you get this from this thing and you get this from this thing. And Hegel's saying, no, if we want to talk about the generality, we get away from those particular materials. Same thing with acid and base, he says. He says, before we get to that, let's see. He says, negative electricity comes to be known as resin electricity, positive electricity is glass electricity. These, as a result of experiments, lose such significance and become purely positive and negative electricity, neither of which is any longer attached to a particular kind of thing. And we can no longer say that there are bodies which are positively electrical and others which are negatively electrical. We realize that we can produce a charge in something, and we can produce another, the opposite charge in things as well. But it's not necessarily tied to the bodies of the Cooper in this case. He goes on and he says, these things are not like a tooth or a claw that remain apart on their own and can be pointed out. This essential nature of theirs to pass over immediately into a neutral product makes their being a being which is implicitly superseded or universal, right? We see that Hegel really likes this, right? They can be superseded, they can be aufgehoben, and they are universal. Now he talks about acid and base. Acid and base have truth only as universals. It says, just as glass and resin can just as well be positively as negatively electrical, in the same way acid and base are not tied as properties to this or that actuality. Each thing is only relatively acid or base. What seems to be an absolute base or acid gets in, and here he talks about the sensualities, and I have to admit I don't really understand the significance of that. I've looked through the commentaries. Different people have different things to say about it. It appears to be sort of a blind alley that you don't really need to know much about, in part because what we do know is that acid and base turn out to be properties of things. They are relative, right? But they actually do belong to certain things. And it has to do with hydrogen and oxygen. And that's part of why he talks about oxygen at the end, by the way. Acid, I'm sorry, in German is Sauer, right? Literally sour, but with a capital S, showing that it's a substantive. And oxygen is Sauerstoff. So that's why he talks about oxygen at the end. Now, we know that physical science has taught us things that Hegel is in contradiction with on this. So, for example, you can't just make anything acidic. Now, you could make your body more acidic or more base, but your body is a massive composite of all sorts of things. You can't actually make, you can make your stomach acid less acid by diluting it, but you're not going to turn it into a base, because then it's not going to be stomach acid, right? So he is wrong about that. What is he getting at here that is valuable? He says that these are not really bodies as such, they're not Körper. They don't exist detached from each other, so they're not non-relative. Acid is relational to base, base is relational to acid, positive and negative electricity are relational to each other. That is actually correct. Now, we could imagine a universe, I suppose, in which there was no base because nothing had a pH level above 7. That's a very difficult universe to imagine, but I suppose it could be done, but it's so far away from where we are that I don't know that that really helps us out much. He also says something else. He says that these are, the result of the experiment is to cancel the moments or activated sides as properties of specific things and to free the predicates from their subjects. Acid becomes a predicate. Base becomes a predicate. A general predicate. A predicate which is a universal, and which he's going to use a term here that Miller is translating, as he has to, as materials, materie, which is different than matter, or in the sense that we're used to thinking of it, or as bodies, right? The bodies in this is translating Körper. So these predicates, like acids and bases, positive and negative electricity, are, you might say, physical phenomena that have some sort of basis in themselves but are relative to others, and that is how they are universals. That's what he's trying to assert here. He says they're neither bodies nor properties. And so, what are examples of this? Oxygen, positive, negative electricity, heat, and so forth. These are not bodies. These are what he's calling materie, materials, or these predicates, these universals. This is going to have an importance a little bit later in the next section, so I don't want to say too much about it here. But Hegel is trying to show us, by using these examples, how reason in its instinctual activity carries out this refining process. So we get positive and negative electricity rather than just, cat electricity and slipper and carpet electricity. We get the general conception of